Hi, I'm Ajit Lin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 21. We have been spending a lot of time going through the 6-layer framework for establishing enterprise architecture practices, and we completed that last week. From this week, we will look at architecture styles and architecture patterns. The intent here is not to have a course on architecture styles or architecture patterns. The intent here is to look at how architecture styles or patterns are relevant on an enterprise architecture practices perspective. Look at some of the common patterns and styles and see how they are relevant on the enterprise architecture. And also the later weeks, we'll look at some of the opportunities that are available on the board on the style perspective as well as architecture pattern perspective, the new age or new age enterprise architecture, right? Let's start with a brief on architecture styles and architecture patterns, right? So let's start with architecture styles. So architecture styles is basically a broad approach. There's always just to emphasize, there's always a confusion when we say what is a style versus what is a pattern. So I'd like to give a brief introduction to style and patterns in my perspective, how I differentiate between an architecture style and pattern, and then we'll get into the details, right? So architecture style, in my view, is a broad approach that serves as a reference for architectural decisions, right? It's primarily very broad. It is not tied to any specific problem statement. That's the key difference, right? Architecture pattern, I consider it as a solution or a repeatable architecture solution for a specific problem statement, whereas architecture style is a broad reference for making architectural decisions. And architecture styles are typically used on the macro level, right? So when we want to look at an enterprise level or a segment level, how we want the architecture to be organized. So for that, we can use the style. It can be applied to enterprise or the segment level. And it basically depends on what styles to choose. It depends on the business model, and it's also driven by the vision as well as architecture principles we lay out, right? And also, it's not necessary that we have to stick to one style. The enterprise or the segment can have more than one architecture style coexisting, and most of the time they are complementary. So as long as they are complementary, we can have more than one style, right? Adopt more than one style. And as I said, it's not tied to a specific problem statement. When we look at patterns, as I said, it is a repeatable architecture solution for a specific problem statements, right? It can be a macro level problem statement or a micro level problem statement. And again, there would be a slight confusion between what we call an architecture pattern versus design pattern, right? So on a broad perspective, I define architecture pattern as a broader in scope than a design pattern, which is probably looking at a very low level, code level frameworks and solutions, right? Whereas when we look at architecture pattern, it's a much broader level solutions. It can drive the decision. So architecture pattern can drive the decisions on what horizontal platform we need to build or the frameworks use, right? And architecture pattern can be industry proven patterns. Their extents, we can extend them, or could be a custom pattern that could be developed for the organization, right? And it is a problem statement can be an IT specific capability for an IT capability, or it could be a business capability problem statement, right? Now, we'll look at some of the common architecture styles. So we'll cover the common architecture styles this week, and then next week we'll cover the patterns, right? So going into common architecture styles, so we'll start with, this is not all the architectural styles available in the market. It is just common, some of the common things I picked just to show the relevance to these styles to the enterprise architecture, right? So let's start with layered architecture, right? So this is, I think everybody should be familiar with it. So it's useful for large enterprises where there is a complex ecosystem. So it helps us in streamlining the operations by splitting into layers, right? So the example on the left is just one example. It could be any way we can split the layers any way the organization wants to, but this is a typical way of splitting into creating the layers. So I have the UI, business service layer, persistence layer, and the data lake or the AI layer, right? One important thing is it helps in building common frameworks. Right? Each layer can have common capabilities that can be built as frameworks. And it also helps in technology standardization, though we can on a single layer, there can be multiple applications. We can have a standardization of technology across layers, which helps in the resource efficiency and saves a lot of cost for the organization. And though I have 4 layers in here, it's not necessary that we should have 4 or it could be more than 4. It can be an n-layered architecture, right? And when the next one I would like to kind of stress upon is the component-based architecture, or what in the modern world we're calling it as composable architecture, where the enterprise or the segment is divided into split into multiple components, independently functioning components that have well-defined interfaces with other components. It is very useful for enterprises that are very dynamic. I mean, they could be going through a lot of acquisitions or a lot of business transformations. So that that dynamism can be achieved by basically um, organizing it as independent components. So any components can at any point of time added or removed or replaced, right? So without impacting the other components, right? It makes it the architecture more composable. And also, it gives us an ability to build the components first and compose them into an enterprise, right? So, and this composition can be done in different ways, like more like a Lego building structure, right? So that helps in composing the enterprise itself as a Lego building structure, so it becomes very flexible, right? So in the modern world, it becomes very useful where there could be a lot of acquisitions. So a new company gets bought over, we can just bring in some components, plug it into the architecture, right? Or if you want to change a business process for a specific area or a domain, we can just replace that, put in a new tool, right? And it continues to work, right? It evolves, right? So that's those kinds of dynamic environment, the component-based architecture makes sense, right? Moving further, service-oriented architecture. So in today's world, I think everybody by default assumes the enterprise to be a service-oriented architecture. So where we have a set of client applications and then all the business capabilities or IT capabilities is delivered as services. Basically the architecture becomes more high, scalable and flexible, and everything is consumed as typically as a web service, but it need not be a web service. It could be consumed as a service in different ways. But typically, nowadays everything we make it as a web service. It simplifies the operations, encourages reusability, right? Um, then we'll move into monolithic architecture. So when we say monolithic architecture, the general perception is that it is outdated and everything has to be service oriented, right? Which is not true, right? So in a micro level, yes, there is a lot of stress towards going towards service oriented architecture. But when we look at a macro level, there are still big relevance for monolithic architecture, right? It is useful basically for enterprises that have independently functioning business segments, right, where the interactions is very less, right? Or it could be in a high compute scenario where the data needs to be available local, right? So those kinds of scenarios, it's on a macro level, monolithic architecture is still very relevant. For example, if you're looking at looking scenarios of the organization adopting an all-in-one CRM solutions, right? So SaaS-based CRM solutions. So the entire package comes in as a built-in solutions where it doesn't need to really be integrated with other applications outside of the CRM platform, right? I mean, internally the CRM could be well service-oriented, but on a macro level, this comes as a monolithic architecture, right? And similarly, we could have scenarios where there are a lot of legacy applications and it's very costly to replace them. There, in those scenarios as well, we can maintain to a monolithic architecture, right? It is a trade-off. So it brings in some operational efficiency, but the flexibility and scalability may be low, right? So just wanted to stress that monolithic architecture, though we say there's a perception that it's outdated. On a when we look at a macro level, it is still very relevant. Moving further, event-driven architecture is another common style we follow nowadays, right? Basically, we have a producer application which produces events of interest to other consumer applications, and the consumer applications listen to that, right? And the key thing is it becomes basically decouples these components or the applications. So the producer need not really know what consumer is going to do with that event. It's just that it produces the event and consumer consumes it and takes action, right? And also it streamlines the interfaces, right? So the events are very lightweight messages, right? So it just sends whatever, just maybe the identifiers or few critical information as part of the event, Rest of the events, rest of the data consumer wants it can actually call the producer with an API and pull the additional information, right? So it kind of streamlines the interfaces, brings in a lot of flexibility, right? And by decoupling, right? So key thing is basically we are encapsulating the each of the applications, and it need not expose what it is doing, right? So that the applications are independent to each other. The next one is publisher subscriber, which is an extension or it basically complements the event-driven architecture. The key thing is here the point-to-point communication is avoided, where we have a generic message bus and the publisher keep publishing events on a topic, and subscribers just subscribes to the event and listens to it, right? So typically it's again extending that flexibility, right, by further decoupling. So because the publisher need not have any knowledge about the subscribers of those events, right? It just keeps publishing whatever it feels that of interest to other applications, right? And the messages would be generic messages, so the interfaces becomes very simplified. Operationally, it simplifies, right? Moving further, another style is pipes and filters, pretty typically useful for segments or enterprises or segments where there is complex data transformation, right? Basically, or if you make complex data transformation, or we have to take actions on a huge volume of data, right? Basically, it can be a near real-time transformation or an offline process, right? The transform basically what we are the style is about is splitting that transformation into multiple different smaller modules, filter modules, which can actually work on the data, keep transforming the data as it goes through a generic data pipe and through the value chain, right? When it goes to the full set of the filters, it has performed all the data transformations needed, right? And there could be intermediate consumable data as well, right? It basically simplifies the operations and also makes the architecture more scalable, right? Another common style is the domain-driven architecture, where we basically it's a kind of goes along with the component-based architecture, where we are basically splitting our the enterprises into different components which are aligned to the domains itself, right? So typically applicable for large enterprises where we have independently working portfolios or segments, right? Each domain, which is a segment, is defined as a component, right? We have clearly defined interface between those components, and basically it derives all the benefits of the component-based architecture. And the plus additional aspect is it is aligned to the business domain, right? So that way, an organization that goes through a lot of business transformation, the domain-based architecture becomes very useful or relevant, because a change or a process change or a business model change on a particular domain does not impact the other domains, right? So the architecture becomes more flexible, right? So these are some of the common pattern styles that are relevant in today's world, right? So quick recap, we looked at architecture styles and patterns. We looked at some of the common architecture styles: layered, component-based, service-oriented, monolithic, event-driven, publisher-subscriber, pipes and filters, and domain-driven architecture, right? So all these are very common styles that are applicable in today's world. Next week, we'll similarly spend some time on the architecture patterns. And then we'll move into some of the opportunities that are available in both the styles perspective and the patterns perspective in the modern enterprise architecture world. Thank you.